All right, now let's talk about multiplying complex or imaginary numbers together. To multiply square roots of negative real numbers, we first need to express them in terms of I. Unfortunately, we can't just take the square root of negative 2 times the square root of negative 5 and say negative 2 times negative 5 is positive 10 and say the square root of 10. What we have to do first is really express each of those as an imaginary number and then complete the multiplication process. So really, the square root of negative 2 is really I rad 2. And the square root of negative 5 is really I rad 5. Now I can multiply together. Now remember when we multiplied radicals, outsides go with outsides and insides go with insides, as long as they're underneath the same radical. So really I have I times I, which is really I squared. And then I have the square root of 2 times the square root of 5, which is really the square root of 10. But if you remember, when we talked about at the beginning of the lesson, that I squared is equal to something. Do you remember what it was equal to? Really, I squared is the same thing as negative 1. So my final answer would actually be negative square root of 10, not positive square root of 10. So it's important that you take these negative roots, make them into imaginary numbers first before you do your multiplication. Let's do a few. Looking at example number 3, we want to multiply and simplify and write our answers into a complex form, a plus bi. For a, remember, we can't just simply multiply like we did before. We have to make them into imaginary numbers first. So the square root of negative 9 is really 3i, right? Or should I say I rad 9? And then the square root of 9 is really just 3. And the square root of negative 36 is really I times the square root of 36, which is really just 6i. So now I have two imaginary numbers, 3i times 6i, that I should be able to multiply together. So just like when I had variables, 3x times 6x is really 18x squared. Well, 3i times 6i is really 18 times I squared. Oh, but remember that I squared? Now that I squared means something, remember? That I squared is really equivalent to negative 1. So I really have the problem that says 18 times negative 1, which is really negative 18. We would have gotten a different answer if we forgot about those negatives. All right, do the same thing for b. Make them into imaginary numbers and then multiply them together. All right, the square root of negative 3 is really I rad 3. The square root of negative 7 is really I rad 7. And now I can multiply these imaginary numbers together. Remember, outsides go with outsides and insides go with insides. So I times I is I squared, and rad 3 times rad 7 is really the square root of 21. I squared, though, remember, is equivalent to negative 1. Now looking at the square root of 21, I don't think there's an even square root, and if I tried to break those down, I wouldn't have enough partners to come out. So it looks like my final answer would just be negative 1 rad 21, or negative rad 21. All right, look at C. I have 12i times 5i. So it looks like on this one, they've already broken them out of the radical and written them in imaginary form already. I can multiply, just like I did before, 12 times 5, and I times I. So I ended up getting 60i squared. But remember, I squared is equivalent to negative 1. And so really I have 60 times negative 1. Or I can say negative 60 for my final answer. All right, look at D and E with me. These we've seen in the past where we need to make sure that we either distribute or FOIL. So here we go. Looking at D, I want to make sure that I distribute the negative 4i to the 3 and the negative 5i. So negative 4i times 3 is really negative 12i, and negative 4i times negative 5i is positive 20i squared. But do you see that I squared again? We know that I squared is really the same thing as negative 1. So negative 1 times 20 really gives me a negative 20. Let's go ahead and make it, though, into the complex form, a plus bi, and we should always be writing that real number first, the negative 20, and then minus the 12i, making sure that we write it in the correct form. E looks like I have two binomials that we want to multiply together, so really I need a FOIL on this one. I'm going to do 1 times 4, I'm going to do 1 times 2i, I'm going to do negative 2i times 4, which is negative 8i, and then negative 2i times a positive 2i is a negative 4i squared. Again, as soon as I see that I squared, I know that I squared is negative 1, so I really have a negative 4 times negative 1, which is a positive 4. I should be able to combine any like terms here, so any real number portion can be put together. So I have a 4 plus 4, which is really 8. And any imaginary terms can be put together. Those are like terms. I have a 2i and a negative 8i. So I can say that my final answer is 8 minus 6i. Being able to multiply imaginary numbers together.